1-888-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN. It's the program for our non-Catholic listeners, those of you who have questions about the Catholic faith, but golly, you can't just walk into a Catholic church, or maybe you would feel uncomfortable about doing that just to start talking to people to try to get those questions answered. This is why we are here. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. We can help you answer that question, 833-288-3986. Outside North America, please dial 1 and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 58177. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply, at least for some folks. You can also shoot us an email if you'd rather do that. The address there is ctc@ewtn.com. Pedro Quiles is our producer. Matt Kabinski is our phone screener. Rich Jesse handles social media for us. If you would like to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, we are streaming on both those platforms even as we speak. Just put your question in the comments box if you would, please. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
I'm very well. How are you, sir?
I'm doing decent, thank you.
Want to let everybody know that EWTN is going to be all over one of your favorite cities, Indianapolis, for the National Eucharistic Congress.
Fantastic.
Which is going to be next week, and our coverage will begin on Wednesday with the opening ceremonies.
We're shipping a big old group of people up there, aren't we?
A lot of folks are going, and EWTN will also have a special day just for EWTN.
Yeah, there's a session at the Congress.
A special session,
right.
A breakout session. That'll be on Thursday.
Fantastic.
And it's like a who's who of Catholic broadcasting. Should be a wonderful thing. So we're going to lead off today with an email here from Frank. This is very interesting, and a lot of people actually ask about this. Why does the Catholic Church certify an apparition of the Mother of God and then say that their messages don't need to be followed because it's private revelation? Isn't that a contradiction?
Not at all. Not at all. So the certification, as it were, the approval, isn't verification that the revelation is supernatural. It isn't verification that the revelation is authoritative. It's certification that the revelation is not heretical, is not spiritually dangerous, that it's edifying, that it's in accord with the Catholic faith, and that there's no evidence that would count against its supernatural origin. I mean, you can't prove the supernatural origin of a private revelation, but you can darn well disprove it.
Yes.
Right? And so it hasn't, you can have a false positive, you're not going to have a false negative, right? So if they say this is not supernatural or this is not orthodox, then you'd pretty well better not follow it. If they say, well, there's no evidence against it being supernatural or against it being orthodox, then it's allowable for Catholics to venerate that particular operation, but not obligatory. Now, why wouldn't you make it obligatory? Well, private revelations are just that, private.
Okay.
Private. If I write a note to my wife and say, please pick up some milk on the way home, that doesn't mean everyone on the planet is supposed to go pick up milk, right? That's just for her, And the private revelations that we have been, quote unquote, certified, to use that word that you used, have all been given in that kind of, narrow, constrained context. They're not revelation that's applicable at all time, everywhere, for the entire universal church and all of humanity, the way sacred scripture and the deposit of faith are. They're contextual, time-bound messages for particular individuals that can be very edifying to people when they give themselves to it, but not obligatory for the church at large.
Okay. Would this be somewhat akin to the imprimatur and nihil obstat that we see in publishing?
That's a decent analogy. If you see a nihil obstat or an imprimatur in a book, it doesn't mean it's a good book. It does not mean it's a good book. It just means it's not a terrible heretical book.
Okay.
Right? It doesn't offend against Catholic faith or morals. It doesn't mean that it gives good advice. It doesn't mean it's recommended.
Okay.
It doesn't mean anything like that.
Okay, Frank, thanks so much for your email. Midnight Writer is watching us on YouTube this afternoon. Midnight Rider says, I have come back to the church, but I still have tools from my days in Wicca. How do I properly dispose of them? Do I burn them? This would include books and cards.
Yeah, let's have a big old bonfire. That sounds like a good
Bonfire.
idea. I mean, just get rid of them. That's the important thing.
That
but if you want to flame them up, that'd be fine.
Sure. Very good. There you go, Midnight Rider. Thanks for watching us on YouTube. Theo says this. Recent surveys show that Christianity in general is losing members quickly, according to Gallup and Pew Research, etc. People are just quitting the faith. Often we are to blame for having so many scandals. What advice could you give to young apologists who are feeling discouraged? Thanks, Theo.
Thanks, Theo. I really appreciate the question. First of all, Christianity is not in decline. It's in decline in the developed world. It's in decline in North America and in Europe. It is experiencing massive growth in Asia and Africa, and so worldwide Christianity continues to grow, but it is declining in the developed Western world. What advice would I give to discouraged Catholic apologists? Well, to begin with, and I say this as somebody who is part of the apologetics industry. Apologetics is the least part of Catholic identity or evangelization or apostolate, and too much of an emphasis on apologetics is really getting your priorities out of whack. You know, St. Paul says, I could have the gift of prophecy and fathom all knowledge, but if I have not love, then I am nothing. And I think it is a grave mistake to believe that the way out of this problem is simply to argue or reason other people into conversion. In fact, the Catholic faith teaches that it is impossible to do that. I mean, it's actually a dogma of the faith that you cannot compel a person to genuine supernatural faith through logical reasoning. What an apologist seeks to do is remove objections and to show that the faith is coherent and beautiful and attractive. But the act of faith is a gift. It's a grace from God that is a total donation of self and commits us to some things that we can know rationally, but to many things that we can't know rationally. So what we have to do is show forth the supernatural transformative power of the Christian faith in human lives, and that goes to the scandal question that you raised.
I'm glad you used the words beautiful and coherent, because it is.
Beautiful and coherent.
Definitely. Thank you, Theo, for your email. In a moment, we'll get to the phones, including you, hopefully, at 833-288-EWTN for Call to Communion.
The most original Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
Each week on the world over, we try to bring you perspectives you're not going to see anywhere else, even in Catholic media. And we also try to bring those cultural figures, world leaders, decision makers, to the audience in, I hope, vibrant way.
The World Over with Raymond Arroyo. Tonight, 8 Eastern on EWTN Radio and Television.
This is Life Issues with Brad Mattis, president of Life Issues Institute.
Here's a fun development to come out of the last vigil held by 40 Days for Life. The group held their spring event outside of abortion centers throughout the nation and around the world. But this year was different. They experienced more twins saved by their efforts. A total of 5 sets of twins were spared a violent death by abortion, and their mothers and fathers avoided the emotionally devastating horrors it often inflicts. Experience shows that twins capture the hearts of women facing an unexpected pregnancy more than a singleton. Twins humanize the unborn in ways one baby cannot. Sad as it is, that's the reality. Sean Carney, president of 40 Days for Life, says, "It never gets old. Human nature kicks in and all of a sudden, these are your children."
Follow us on social media at Life Issues Institute.
It's Called to Communion on this Thursday afternoon here on EWTN Radio. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. We have a couple lines open for you right now. Also right now, let me tell you about something beautiful from EWTN's religious catalog. It's a statue of Saint Benedict. In this statue, Saint Benedict is shown holding his rule in his right hand, the rule of St. Benedict, and his crozier, depicting his role as abbot, in his left hand. You know, St. Benedict wrote the rule in 516, way back when, for monks living in community under the authority of an abbot. More than half the chapters describe how to be obedient and humble, and what to do when a member of that community is not. And the remainder of the book deals with how to regulate the work of God and how the monastery should be managed, following the motto, ora et labora, pray and work. This beautiful statue, 8 inches high, 3 inches wide, nearly 3 inches deep. It's made of a plaster resin mix. It's hand-painted in Colombia. If you go to EWTNRC.com and search St. Benedict statue, you can see what it's all about. Again, EWTNRC.com. Call to Communion in progress here on EWTN. Just heard from Dave watching us on YouTube. Dave says, how do I reply to a Baptist who says his church started in the early church? He said it is New Testament church in perpetuity, and the belief was indeed there in the early churches. Any thoughts about that?
Yep, the burden of proof is on the one who asserts.
Yes, indeed.
So show me the money, bud. show me the evidence that second century Christians believed as modern Southern Baptists do. You won't find it. You won't find it. You will find people baptizing adult believers in the second century, but the rationale they give for that practice is so different from the practice of Southern Baptists that it's completely total different theological universes. In antiquity, it was not uncommon to delay baptism into adulthood, but not because they thought, as Baptists do, that infant baptism is invalid, but because they really believed that baptism washed away all original and actual sin. And many people thought, well, if that's the case, I'll just put baptism off until I'm on my deathbed, and then I'll get it all forgiven in one fell swoop, right? And that's what Constantine did, the Emperor Constantine. That's not the rationale for believers' baptism within the Baptist tradition. So that's the only point of commonality I can come up with would be that particular practice, but again, for completely un-Baptistic reasons. Other than that, I mean, the early fathers believed in apostolic succession. They believed in the supernatural efficacy of the sacraments. They absolutely did not believe in a conversionistic account of Christian initiation, but believed that baptism is the rite of initiation. They did not believe in justification by faith alone, but absolutely believed that we merit salvation through the grace of God. So they venerated saints. They venerated relics. They definitely weren't Congregationalists in their form of church government. I mean, on just about every point of doctrine where Baptists differ from Catholics, well, no, not just about, on all of them, the church fathers come down on the Catholic side of things. So, and they certainly didn't believe in the doctrine no creed but the Bible, which is another Catholic mainstay, right? They didn't have the Bible.
Yeah,
they only had creeds.
Sure.
Right. So, I mean, show me the evidence. Let's go grab a copy of Lightfoot's Apostolic Fathers or any other collection of ancient Christian writings that you like, and let's take a look at it and see if we can find, the Baptist Philadelphia Confession. I don't think you're going to find it.
I was just thinking, as you were explaining this, I was just thinking of a producer who worked for us many years ago. He's now retired, and he had been a Southern Baptist, became a Catholic, and as often happens when one makes a big switch like that, they've got all these books in their library and they just want to get rid of them. And so he brought a bunch of these to the radio station, and I was looking through one of them, and I remember the phrase, First Baptist Church of Jerusalem.
Right.
And I thought, okay, maybe we're going to pass on that book.
So, while I'm on that topic, there's a little volume that helped me a lot over the years by an Anglican historian. He's not Catholic. His name is J.N.D. Kelly. The book is called Early Christian Doctrine. And what Kelly does is he simply goes through the fathers, and he divides it into ante-Nicene and post-Nicene fathers. So those before the Council of Nicaea, those after the Council of Nicaea. And just poses sort of the standard loci of theology, soteriology, sacramentology, ecclesiology, these kinds of things. And then says, what did the fathers of this century think on this topic? And he gives you kind of a digest sampling from, the likes of Justin Martyr or Tertullian or Clement of Alexandria, whoever it might be. And it gives you citations and page numbers, and here's what they thought. And that helped me a lot, because you can go through there on any particular Christian doctrine and look up, okay, here's what the fathers actually said on this topic. And you know what they weren't saying? They weren't saying the Baptist stuff. Right?
Yeah.
So anyway, J.N.D.
Yeah.
Kelly's Early Christian Doctrine might be a resource for you.
Fascinating. And Dave, thanks for watching us this afternoon on YouTube. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN, beginning with Jackie in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, listening on the great Divine Mercy Radio. Hi, Jackie. What's on your mind today?
Thank you for taking my call. I am a devout Catholic, and I know that some people have left other denominations to come to the Catholic Church, and we welcome them. I guess my question is, for those that have given up their manses and their probably many friends with fiducia supplicans, I don't know if now they're confused. Like, I'm confused. I don't know why they wouldn't be confused. And I think when you say that 3 years ago or 2 years ago they weren't okay with this kind of blessing, and now they are, I guess I'm just wondering why that wouldn't be confusing to the young people.
Well, I think it absolutely is confusing to the young people. You just told me they're confused, and the people you know are confused. I understand they're confused. Why are they confused, however? Is there a problem with the church's doctrine or practice? Or is it, and this is what I think personally, when fiducia supplicans came out, did all the usual characters make hay of fiducia supplicans, right? There are people who have an agenda, obviously, ideological agenda, to try to force the Catholic Church into their corner. And so, Pope Francis kind of notoriously sometimes speaks in an ambiguous manner, and he speaks sort of casually and off the cuff and gives radio interviews and stuff, and sometimes he says things that are kind of hard to follow. That's his pastoral style. It's very different from John Paul II, who kept a Polish Dominican at his elbow every moment, who vetted every word that he said. I mean, there's two different popes, two different pastoral styles.
Can you explain what that document is?
Yeah, so I'm getting to that.
Okay,
I'm getting to that. All right.
Very good.
But whenever the Pope says something, there are people who want the Pope to have said their thing, right? They want the Pope to come out in support of their position. And so what they'll do is they'll read the document, journalists and so forth. They'll read the document. They'll glom onto one sentence or one phrase that they're able to take out of context and say, see, now the Pope supports us. And then you go actually read the document. You're like, Pope didn't say anything like what you just said. Similarly, it used to frustrate me when Pope Benedict was Pope, and I thought, he's such a brilliant biblical theologian, such a scintillating thinker. He's got all these magnificent books. We're going to have this massively intellectual papacy. He's going to teach Catholic doctrine, and he'll bring this illuminating clarity to the entire world. And his encyclicals are wonderful, and his apostolic exhortations are wonderful. And several years into his pontificate, I realized I'm the only person who's reading them. I and people like me,
Sure.
And the media was saying all kinds of nonsense about Pope Benedict, and I'm like, you actually haven't read a word the man has said, have you? Yeah. No, they didn't read a word he said. And so that's the kind of problem that we have. What fiducia supplicans deals with is the administering of blessings, priestly blessings.
Okay.
And it explicitly teaches that, and this is the hot button issue, right? That homosexual people cannot be validly married to one another. Well, unless, they could be if one's male and one's female, right? But two males can't be validly married, two females can't be validly married to one another. And that hasn't changed. That's always been the case, and it's always going to be the case. The question is, let's say you are a priest who works at, say, some national shrine, and people, Catholics, non-Catholics, pet owners, you name it, all kinds of people come to this shrine. They show up, and some couple walks up to you, and they're holding hands, and you have questions, right? You have questions, and they say, "Father, would you bless us?" Well, what do you do? What do you do? And the church says, provided that the act of blessing not be construed as conferring some kind of sacred status on what appears to be an intrinsically immoral union. And that's a big caveat. Yeah, the priest can respond to that request for blessing. And that's, it's clearly analogous to the situation, let's say a gay couple comes to Mass. They sit to the end of the Mass. The end of the Mass, what does the priest say? May Almighty God bless you, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. He's just blessed everybody in the congregation, regardless of what their individual moral situation is. Mm-hmm. Right? So, yes, has the church extended blessings to people that are in irregular situations? Yes, of course, and the Mass would be one context in which that can happen. Right? This is explicit instruction about the way that kind of thing can legitimately happen and the circumstances under which it cannot. And the document goes to great length to specify all the situations in which you can't do that precisely because it would give the wrong impression. Now, the fact that someone has skimmed the document and walked away with the wrong impression just goes to show that you need clarity on how not to give the wrong impression, which is what the document is about.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there you go. And thank you so much for that question. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Let's go to Craig now in Temecula, California, listening on the EWTN app. Hey there, Craig, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hey, guys, a daily listener. I appreciate your program and all you guys do. I'm having conversation with a non-Christian, non-Catholic, old high school buddy, and he hit me up the other day with a question about the Old Testament. He's wondering how a loving God would send Joshua into Jericho and wipe out an entire families, men, women, and children. What type of a loving God would do that, and then what happened to those innocent people? Do they eventually end up in heaven? And I didn't have a good answer for him, so I thought I'd reach out to you guys for a little help.
Yeah, thanks. So Catholic theologians have given different answers to that question over the centuries, but I'm going to give you one answer that is probably going to shock you, but I assure you that it is a position that's been alive and well in Catholic hermeneutical circles for 1,700 years. God didn't. God didn't. All right. What do I mean? So when you encounter something in the Old Testament that appears to cast God in an unjust light, makes God seem tyrannical or arbitrary or unjust, there are at least two responses you can have to that. All right. Or maybe three. One is you can say, well, this is all hogwash and I don't believe the Bible. That's the atheist response. The other one is the Protestant fundamentalist response. Which is to say, also it was Luther's response, it was Calvin's response, which is to say, who are you, O man, to talk back to God? If God says you should, torture people and kill their babies, well, that must be good because God said so. That's the divine command ethic response. It's what Plato parodied and ridiculed in the Euthyphro dialogue, right? And there are Christians who take that position. Well, if God commanded it, it must be okay. I don't understand, but he's God, I'm not, so have at it. Then there's what is really kind of the overwhelming Catholic point of view, which is to say that our intuitions about justice and equity are valid, like they're veridical. And so if I run into something in the Old Testament that seems to conflict with what I would otherwise know justice entails, then I have to dig deeper and say, what am I missing here? And the Catholic Church has always taught, following Jesus and St. Paul, that the Old Testament has, in addition to its literal sense, a spiritual sense, right, where we can read in things like allegories into the Old Testament. And that's, all Catholics believe that. Some Catholics go so far as to hold that the literal sense is, in occasions, non-historical. And so when you come up with something that seems impossible to account for if it's historical, we'll just say, well, then that didn't happen as reported, and this is here for the sake of drawing us into a deeper deeper spiritual sense. Probably the chief proponent of that position was Origen of Alexandria, late 2nd, early 3rd century. When Origen would run into passages of the Old Testament that he thought were just manifestly problematic, his response was they're not historical. They didn't happen that way, and the difficulties are there to force us to consider the spiritual sense of the sacred text. He once wrote, we should throw away the literal sense of the Scriptures as the bitter rind of a nut. All right. Most Catholics won't go as far as Origen, but some do. Some do. Gregory of Nyssa, who was a student of Origen and one of the Cappadocian Fathers, an incredibly important theologian, says something very similar in his document, The Life of Moses. Now, modern Catholic scholars, including Pope Benedict XVI, say, the literal sense is really the sense that the sacred author meant to convey, and getting at that is a complicated matter that requires the tools of higher criticism. And they would look at some of these Old Testament passages and say, well, the textual and archaeological evidence suggests from a historical point of view that this is not historical reporting, that this is sort of after-the-fact storytelling in the process of nation building that sets the nation of Israel in a context in ancient Canaan in relationship to its neighbors and the story of the conquest, that's not straightforward historical reporting, and so it actually coheres very well with the idea of Origen and Nyssa and other fathers that not to be taken as a straightforward literal historical account. Pope Benedict treats it that way, and a modern author who explicates Benedict's point of view that I highly recommend to you is Matthew Ramage, who wrote a book called The Dark Passages of the Old Testament, Reading the Bible with St. Thomas Aquinas and Pope Benedict XVI. Also, Benedict's Apostolic Exhortation, Verbum Domini, on the Word of God, talks about how to interpret these passages. And we don't interpret them like a fundamentalist. That's the takeaway.
Craig, thanks so much for your call from Temecula. Hey, lines are open for you right now. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-EWTN, 833-288-3986 for Call to Communion.
Here comes today's quote from Mother Angelica's perpetual calendar. To pray the prayer of the heart is an intention. It is a desire just to be with Jesus, knowing that you are absolutely, totally inadequate, and you have nothing to offer, and still you're there with Him. Mother Angelica's perpetual calendar features an inspirational message for each day of the year. It's available at EWTNRC.com.
EWTN Radio is all over social media. All your favorite programs are available right now. Check us out on X at EWTN Radio. Remember, EWTN is everywhere.
This is Sandra McDevitt with a Did You Know moment. Did you know Lucy of the Narnian Chronicles may be based on a Catholic saint? Blessed Lucy of Narni had visions of Our Lady and the child Jesus at age 5. Wanting to be a religious, she was persuaded to marry a man who did not understand her spirituality. She became a Dominican tertiary and received the stigmata. Jealousy caused her to be labeled a fraud, and she spent 39 years in exile. Lucy Pevensey, like Blessed Lucy, saw things others couldn't see. C.S. Lewis wove that into Prince Caspian. Lucy was the only one for most of the story to see Aslan, and Lucy entered Narnia with childlike faith. Now you know how Lucy of Narnia may be based on a Catholic saint. I'm Sandra McDevitt for EWTN Radio.
I'm Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers. Join me for Beacon of Truth today at 4 p.m. Eastern.
On the next Beacon of Truth, the cardinal virtue of fortitude and soulful Psalm 125.
Now back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
It's Call to Communion on this Thursday afternoon here on EWTN. If you've got a question for Dr. David Anders, we are here for you. 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. There's a line open right now with your name on it. Hey, congratulations going out to another member of the EWTN radio family, Divine Mercy Broadcasting, now with 7 FM signals in the state of Washington, celebrating 11 years with EWTN. How about that? Congratulations to Joe and John Haberman, Michael Drollman, and their great team at Divine Mercy Broadcasting from your friends here at EWTN Radio. Well, we got a call from Rick in Cleveland who couldn't stay on the phone, but he left this for us. Dr. Anders, I am in my 70s. I'm handicapped and excessively obese. I cannot make it to Mass for those reasons. I have never really done anything wrong, but is it okay that I don't go to Mass and just pray some on Sundays?
Okay, thanks, Rick. I really appreciate the question. So to begin with, if it's physically impossible to go to Mass, you're not obligated to go to Mass. God doesn't demand the impossible. If you literally cannot get out of the house and go to Mass, you're not obligated to go. So there you go. Now, is it sufficient to pray only on Sundays? Well, Christ exhorts us to pray every day.
Every day.
St. Paul tells us to pray without ceasing. So it sounds like you're in significant amount of distress and suffering, and my heart goes out to you. I'm really, really sorry to hear that. And I don't want you to suffer. I want you to be able to stop suffering. But insofar as suffering is something that you can't control, then our willing acceptance of the will of God and what providence brings into our life is meritorious. We can offer that up for the salvation of souls and for our own sanctification, as Christ did when he said, "Not my will, but thine be done." If this is the cross that the Lord has sent you to bear for right now, it doesn't mean it'll be there tomorrow, but if that's what you're dealing with right now, then that suffering, doesn't have to be wasted. It can be an occasion of sanctification and so forth. Now, I do have to touch on the question, I haven't ever really done anything wrong, all right, because St. John tells us in his epistle that if we say we have no sin, then we are liars, right? But if we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Might recommend, get a hold of a good guide to an examination of conscience. I know the Fathers of Mercy, Father Wade Menendez, who's often a guest on EWTN, his community, on their website, they publish a kind of an extensive examination of conscience. Go through an examination of conscience and assure yourself that you haven't even committed a venial sin. I think that's a pretty tall order to be persuaded that I've never even committed a venial sin. And then and if you schedule an appointment. If you can't get out of the house and go to the church to go to confession, then you can request that a priest could come visit you. And doesn't mean he's going to come every month, but once a year he could come and say, I need help making an examination of conscience because I'm not, I don't think I've ever done anything wrong, but I know St. John says that if I say I have no sin, the truth isn't in me. So help me examine my conscience in my life and let's see if there's anything that I need to get right with God about. So
definitely. And, something that may be very good for you, Rick, would be the daily Mass that we
That's
broadcast
true. You can watch daily Mass
on EWTN television each and every day. We make no exceptions. So you may want to check that out. And God bless you, my friend. Thanks so much for your call. Here now is John in Vancouver, Washington, listening on his Alexa device. Hey, John, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hey, I have two quick, brief questions. The difference between the terms being convicted and being convinced. I hear a lot of Protestant preachers talking about being convicted of this and being convicted of that when they got convicted. And then I even on the Catechism in a year that I'm 2/3 of the way through, I'm hearing a lot of that use of that word. And I'm a cradle Catholic. There wasn't a whole lot of convicting anybody when I grew up in the language of the church, such as it was pre-Vatican II and all that. So I was just wondering about the connotations of convicted versus convinced, because I always feel convinced about my own sinfulness and Jesus, saving us and all that. And the other question is Mary. I mean, she was assumed into heaven. She was sinless. Therefore, she wouldn't be a candidate for death. So why would there be any question about whether or not she was taken up alive to heaven rather than had to experience death, which she wouldn't be eligible for under the circumstances?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate both questions. Thank you so much. So, of course, the dictionary definition of to convict is to find someone guilty in a court of law. So the idea here really is the being persuaded of one's objective guilt. That's the sense that people mean when they say, well, I am convicted. That means, Acts 2:37, when St. Peter preached to the crowds, the apostle writes that when they heard this, they were pierced to the heart. And I think that's what people mean to evoke when they say, I feel convicted. I feel like I've been called to account for doing something wrong, or I've been called to account for some omission that I need to rectify. Yeah, busted. Yeah, exactly. And to convince, of course, is to persuade someone of some fact, and it need not imply any kind of moral dimension at all. I mean, I might become convinced that it's going to rain this afternoon, and therefore I will carry an umbrella. I might become convinced that the Catholic faith is true, and I may or may not feel convicted about that.
Okay.
Right? So they do have a different denotation and connotation. With respect to the Blessed Virgin Mary, I'm going to have to dissent from your claim that having no personal sin, she would necessarily be immortal, because, of course, that didn't apply to the Son of God. Right? Jesus had no sin, and, of course, dying on the cross was one of the principal things he came to accomplish. In the Catholic tradition, there are at least two divergent accounts of what happened to the Blessed Virgin Mary at the end of her life. In one of them, she is assumed body and soul into heaven without suffering death. In another account, she is assumed body and soul into heaven after suffering physical death. The Dormition is called, and how she's venerated in the East. And both of them are allowable Catholic images of Our Lady. And so I have to dispute the claim that she would not be subject to death because of her sinlessness.
John, thanks so much for your call. Here is Pamela now in Piedmont, South Dakota, listening on the great Real Presence Radio. Hi, Pamela. What's on your mind today?
Hi. A couple things. One of them, yesterday you were explaining to a gentleman who was asking if Jesus was a divine or a human person. And you explained it, but I wondered if you shouldn't have just said very specifically that no, he was a human person with he was a divine person with a human nature, because I've talked to a lot of people and I just learned it a few years ago. I thought he was both, as a person, divine and human. So that nature thing is, I thought, really important. So I don't know what you feel about that. The other thing I wanted to say was a few years ago, I think I sent you a text, and I asked about a question, something you had talked about Mary. And so when I sent it to you, you put it on the air, and you said, I love this question. It's so contextualized. It's this and that and the other thing, and how intelligent it was. And really, I had kind of written down what you said. But, I used it for my homeschooling kids. I said, look at Dr. Anders' thing about me. So I wanted to share that.
Well, I hope the homeschooling kids showed you all kinds of respect after that.
Rock on, Pamela.
Yeah, absolutely. No, the definition that you gave of Christ's personhood, I affirm. And I think I said that. I know I added a lot of elaboration, but Christ is a divine person. Well, the second person of the Trinity is a divine person who assumes a human nature in the incarnation. That is the Catholic dogma on the person of Christ. Yeah, to be sure.
Okay. Thanks for your call, Pamela. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN Radio. Let's go to Joni in San Diego, listening on the EWTN app. Hey, Joni, what's on your mind today?
Hi, good morning from San Diego. I am trying to find a place where I can tell my Buddhist friend who vehemently said that, when I suggested moving my son into a Catholic-run special needs home as he gets older, she's, well, the Catholic Church killed tens of thousands of children in their orphanages and schools in the U.S. And I said, no, they didn't. She said, oh, yes, they did. I want to be able to rebut that in a way where she can read and know that that's an absolute untruth.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So there have been scandals that have taken place in Catholic institutions with children. That's something that's very well established. Proving that something didn't happen, it's impossible to prove a negative. You have to come forth with evidence for the accusation.
As you said earlier in the show.
Yeah, exactly. If I tell you, I would like you to prove that there are no unicorns. Well, all you can do in response to a request like that is say, well, I've never seen evidence of a unicorn. Can you produce some? Right? There's no evidence that the Catholic Church did what your friend asserts. There is evidence that priests and clergy and religious and sisters have abused children in Catholic institutions. Now, how do we deal with that fact? Well, there is a huge sex abuse scandal, huge, that just absolutely magnificently enormous sex abuse scandal that dwarfs anything that's been claimed about the Catholic Church. And that is the sexual abuse of children in public institutions of education, public schools. The scale of abuse is much greater than what you would find in the Catholic Church. That does not justify for 1 second anything that happened to a kid in a Catholic institution that was abused. It's horrible that it should ever happen. But it underscores the fact that the way scandal and abuse gets reported in the media and by historians is influenced by the fact that journalists have agendas. And they have an agenda to cast the Catholic Church in a particular light, to put a spotlight on the Catholic Church in a way that makes it seem, it's propagandized, right? It makes it seem like the Catholic Church is the most corrupt institution on the planet. When if you examine those same kinds of behaviors in all kinds of institutions, you'll find that the bad apples in the Catholic Church are very much like bad apples everywhere, right?
Yeah.
There are scandalous things that have happened in the Catholic Church. There are scandalous things that happen in almost any institution.
Sure.
There's a book I would recommend to you by Philip Jenkins, who is a non-Catholic historian. The book is called, just a second, it's coming to me, The New Anti-Catholicism, The Last Acceptable Prejudice.
Oh, yes.
The New Anti-Catholicism, The Last Acceptable Prejudice. And it is an account of what I'm talking about, of the tendency of bad actors in the media to represent the problems in the Catholic Church in an unfair way, to make it seem that the Catholic Church is a lot worse than it is. Written by a non-Catholic who says, look, in the interests of honest reporting, we just have to come to terms with this fact about the way the Catholic Church is represented in the public sphere. So that's probably the best resource I could give you. There's also a scholar by the name of Carol Shakeshaft from Hofstra University who's done a lot of work on this sort of comparative business of abuse in the Catholic Church compared to other institutions like public school systems, to put it in context, to put it in a real basis of comparison. So those are two resources you might want to look at.
Joni, thanks so much for your call. David, I'm very upset about this business about there being no unicorns. Are you sure about this? This is very distressing.
Well, I have no positive evidence of unicorns, Tom.
All right. I don't know. This is going to mess up my whole day here. It's called a communion here on EWTN. I'll tell you something that is wonderful, that is existent. It's a great book available from EWTN Publishing, His Angels at Our Side, Understanding Their Power in Our Souls and in the World by Father John Horgan. This great book unveils the surprising role of the angels in our lives and what you must do to gain their help. In this great book, you'll learn how to imitate the angels in prayer and how they, the angels, offer you the enlightenment and encouragement God so desperately wants to give you. Do check out this book. It is a winner. His Angels at Our Side, Understanding Their Power in Our Souls and in the World by Father John Horgan. It's available now from EWTN Publishing and EWTN's Religious Catalog. Buy Catholic, shop Catholic. EWTN rc.com.
I met Father Horgan one time.
Did you?
Yep. I think he was getting ready to go on Father Mitch's show or on Johnette's show. I don't remember which, but I was tooling around the television studio and I ran into this priest. I think he's from Vancouver. Wasn't he from Vancouver?
I believe so, yeah.
And I started talking to him, thought he was a delightful individual, learned about his angel book. And then I was very sad to learn that he died October of 22.
Yes.
So we lost him. So we had to read his book in memory of Father Horgan.
The book lives on, and it's got a lot to teach us, that's for sure. Here is Jason now in Tennessee, listening on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Jason, what's on your mind today, sir?
I spoke to somebody else earlier, so this is the second time.
Yeah, you talk to the call screener. The call screener answers the phone, makes sure the question is appropriate for radio, and if he puts you through to us, then you ask live on air. Now you're live on air. Everybody in the world can hear you. So now you can ask the question in a way that everybody can hear it.
There you go.
All right. Awesome. All right, so my question was in regards to syncretism and how it relates to like Germanic paganism and maybe some of their rituals and festivals and symbols. And as a side note, kind of how scholars came to have the Icelandic sources like the Prose Edda and the Havamal. But if you could kind of sum up what syncretism is.
Yeah, sure. Syncretism refers to mixing elements from different religious traditions, right? And to a certain extent, syncretism happens all the time, and there's a kind of a benevolent syncretism, and then there's a malicious syncretism. There's a deleterious syncretism. And so, when a Catholic puts a Christmas tree in the den of his house next to his hearth and puts presents under it on Sunday morning, did the Christmas tree tradition come into Catholic practice through paganism? You bet, right? Are we worshiping trees? No, we're not. Are we sacrificing infants to tree gods? No, we're not, right? So it's possible to, as it were, baptize some element of paganism and to keep it within the Catholic tradition in a way that's edifying or at least harmless, and there's no objection to that. Every time you walk into a public building in the United States, you're stepping into a kind of a relic of a Roman or Greek temple, right? But we're not there to sacrifice to Aphrodite. We're probably there to get a new license plate. I mean, so that's
Big
okay.
difference.
It's okay to take elements from other cultures and traditions. Anyway, regardless of what the opponents of cultural appropriation may have to say about that, we culturally appropriate all the time, and there's nothing objectionable about that per se. It becomes objectionable to a Catholic when the syncretistic element begins to deform some essential point of Catholic faith or practice. And so, for example, the Catholic Church has a very strong prohibition against necromancy, against attempting to commune with the dead. But there are syncretistic, quasi-Catholic cults that have brought in that practice, in a superstitious way. And so people sort of have been known to sort of mix and merge elements of pagan spirit worship with Catholic devotion to the saints. That would be an example of a very unacceptable form of syncretism, a heretical form of syncretism that the Church would condemn. Did Germanic pagan practice influence Catholicism at any point in time? Absolutely it did. And I'll give you an example of something that came into Catholic practice in the early Middle Ages and was eventually opposed by the Church, and that would be the tradition of trial by ordeal. Somebody's accused of a crime, and so, you shove their hand in boiling oil, and bring it out and see if the wound festers and gets infected. And if it festers and gets infected, then you pronounce them guilty. And if it doesn't, then you exonerate them. And this was parodied, of course, in Monty Python's famous movie, The Holy Grail,
Yes.
where they weigh the woman accused of witchcraft to see if she weighs more than a duck, to determine whether or not she's made of wood, therefore flammable, and therefore a witch,
Therefore?
You're right. So that actually, I don't know about the duck business, but the idea of trial by ordeal really did happen in Catholic countries, and was a holdover from Germanic paganism, right? Something that the pagans did before they were Catholicized, if you will.
Yeah.
And the Church, it took a while to extirpate that practice, but by 1215 of the Fourth Lateran Council, the Church said, no priest can ever bless a trial by ordeal. And that pretty much put the death knell to trial by ordeal. And in place, the Church developed things like the jury system and rules of evidence and testimony that form the basis of the modern legal system today, right? The rational, humanitarian ways of bringing about justice. I'll give you another one. There's a woman by the name of Karen Jolie, I think is her name, who wrote a really interesting book, 20, 30 years ago, on Saxon elf charms.
Oh my!
Right, and these were syncretistic prayers, purportedly offered by Catholic priests to exorcise elves from people's fields and cattle. Right.
Okay.
And obviously the Catholic Church does not believe in elves. There are no elves. Not even Santa's helpers. Right. There are none. Right. But that was a pagan belief. They believed in elves and sprites and fairies and things of that sort. And so when those people were initially Christianized, it's not surprising that many of them retained a lot of their popular superstitious beliefs. And it took a while for the Church to kind of get those out of their system, so to speak. And this 9th century Saxon England was a snapshot. Jolie captures that, some documentary evidence. And of course, nobody in the Catholic Church is today exorcising elves, right? So there has been syncretism, but the bishops get a hold of it and they go, no, we're not doing this anymore, and they kind of get that out of the tradition. How do we have the documentary evidence for Icelandic saga? Well, I'm not an expert on Icelandic saga. My understanding is we don't have a lot of it. And I think, the manuscript evidence, almost every ancient manuscript has a history of transmission. Any critical introduction to those would probably give you the scholarly details. That's a little bit outside my area of expertise.
Jason, thanks so much for your call. I must say, David, first the unicorns and now the Keebler elves. This means we won't have any cookies anymore. This is very distressing.
Well, sorry.
Oh, man. Here is a question from Mark on YouTube who says, can an Eastern Rite Catholic patriarch or a cardinal become a pope?
Well, it hasn't happened, although there have been Greek Catholics that have become Pope, Greek-speaking Romans in the earliest centuries that became Pope. And, if an Eastern Rite cardinal or patriarch were elected Pope, he would become Roman Rite, right? Because he'd have to be the Bishop of Rome, right? So he would have to be the Patriarch of the West. That's part of the Pope's job description. The Bishop of Rome is not only the universal pastor of the Church, but he also happens to be Patriarch of the West and of the Latin Rite. Yeah. So, I suppose it's possible, and I'm really way beyond my purview here, but I think it's possible that a cleric from the East could change rites and ascend to a Western patriarchate.
Okay.
But he would in fact be the Patriarch of the West.
Sure. Mark, thanks so much for watching us on YouTube this afternoon. Sylvia has this emailed question: what can I do or advise others to do when experiencing a crisis of faith? When I wonder if I'm, quote, praying correctly and comparing myself to others in Mass, and I feel like everybody else is more holy or more devout than I am.
Oh, that probably means you're more holy and more devout than they are. I'm serious about that. Yeah. Okay. So I'm really glad you wrote, and I hope I can help you. I think probably one of the most unhelpful things you could ever do is try to assess the quality of someone's prayers by how they appear at Mass.
Yeah.
Because the kinds of things that are visible to you in someone's behavior have zero evidentiary value in determining the quality of the prayer. What could you notice at Mass? Passion, outward signs of devotion, bodily postures, evidences of emotion on one's face or one's gestures. None of that has anything to do with true holiness. And Francis of Sales wrote a whole book on this, his Introduction to the Devout Life. First chapter, best thing ever written on this topic. He goes through all the stuff that isn't true devotion. And basically, anything that you could notice at Mass that your neighbor is doing doesn't fall under the category of true devotion according to Francis of Sales. What does fall under the category of true devotion, according to St. Francis of Sales, Doctor of the Faith? Love of God and neighbor. Love of God and neighbor.
That's simple.
That's the index of true devotion is, do you love God and love neighbor? Are you growing in the life of virtue? Your own assessment of your own holiness. Again, not an accurate gauge. John of the Cross said that many people pray quite badly and think they pray well. Many people pray quite well and think they pray badly. And who falls into the first category? Well, the guy who falls in love with his own sense of affective, hypnotic, entranced absorption in the experience of God. The guy who's still tripping on the God candy, right? The guy who's like, look at me, how holy I am and how many hours I spend in prayer and how awesome I feel and how elevated my emotions and how often I swoon and I shed tears and, oh, aren't I the great thing? And then here comes this 2-year-old knocking on the door and he says, Later, Sonny, Daddy's busy communing with God. That guy has totally missed the boat. Totally missed the boat.
Jesus had a few things to say about that.
Had a few things to say about that,
sure.
Exactly. Well, if there's anything like my 2-year-old, the 2-year-old doesn't let that go and comes in and just sits on your head while you're praying, and then you're kind of forced out of yourself. It's one of the reasons that having children is sanctifying, because they don't give you time to be nearly as selfish as you'd like to be.
Yeah, so Sylvia, don't be so hard on yourself,
Not
right?
At all.
All right. Hey, Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tom. Once I was grading papers when I was in grad school. Yeah? My 2-year-old came to the door, and I thought if I sit real quiet, maybe he'll go away, he'll ignore me. He walks into the room, climbs up on the desk, and literally sits on my head.
Sits on your head.
And I was like, okay, papers going aside, time for a tickle.
There you go. Don't forget, we do this program Monday through Friday right here on EWTN at 2 p.m. Eastern. On behalf of our fantastic team, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. Thanks for joining us. See you tomorrow on the Friday edition of Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders, and we will see you then. God bless.
I'm Jeanette DeMello, Editor-in-Chief of the National Catholic Register, and together with Matthew Bunson, I co-host Register Radio, where every week we talk to the Register's writers and editors about the...
Able, when you need to know, turn to